They were told that American soldiers were demons with no honor, that they hurt prisoners and showed no mercy. But when 47 Japanese women stepped off the transport ship at San Francisco Bay in September 1945, what stopped them wasn't cruelty. It was beauty. "They look like movie stars," one woman whispered in Japanese, staring at the tall American soldiers on the dock. Her friend grabbed her arm, terrified someone had heard. But the words had already escaped, and they would echo through the camp for months to come, changing everything these women believed about their enemy. If you're interested in untold World War II stories that challenge everything you thought you knew, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These hidden histories deserve to be remembered. The autumn sun hung low over San Francisco Bay, painting the water gold and orange. The transport ship groaned as it pulled into the dock, its engines shutting down after weeks at sea. On deck, 47 Japanese women stood in two silent lines. Their dark hair was pulled back in tight buns. Their simple cotton uniforms were wrinkled and stained with salt from the long Pacific crossing. Most were in their 20s, though a few were barely 18. They had been nurses, radio operators, clerks, and translators stationed across the Pacific Islands, Saipan, Okinawa, the Philippines. When the Emperor's voice crackled over radios announcing surrender, their world had ended. Now they were prisoners, being transported to the land of the enemy. The September air was cool, but not cold. A breeze carried the smell of the ocean mixed with something else. Car exhaust, perhaps. The scent of a city that had never been bombed. The women gripped the ship's railing, watching the dock grow closer. Behind them, American sailors moved efficiently, preparing to unload. Their voices were casual, even cheerful. No one shouted. No one hit anyone. The women had expected violence from the moment of capture, but so far there had been only order. Then they saw them. The American soldiers waiting on the dock. Kiko, a 24-year-old former nurse from Tokyo, felt her breath catch. The soldiers stood in neat rows, their uniforms crisp and perfectly fitted. But it wasn't the uniforms that shocked her. It was them. They were tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and confident postures. Their hair was neatly combed, their faces clean-shaven and healthy. Some were smoking cigarettes, the smoke curling lazily in the afternoon light. Others stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, watching the ship with mild curiosity. The sunlight hit them perfectly, making them look like they'd stepped out of the American films that had been banned in Japan since 1941, films Kiko had seen as a teenager before. The war took over everything. "They look like movie stars," whispered Yuki, standing beside her. Kiko's hand shot out, gripping Yuki's wrist. "Don't say that," she hissed in Japanese, but her eyes betrayed her. She was staring too. Around them, other women were having the same reaction. Confused glances, wide eyes, whispered breaths. They had been prepared for monsters. The propaganda had shown Americans as crude, violent beasts with no culture or honor. But these men looked nothing like that. They looked healthy, clean, and strangely elegant in their uniforms. It made no sense. The gangway was lowered with a metallic clang that made several women flinch. An American officer, tall with graying hair at his temples, walked up the ramp. He stopped in front of the Japanese women and spoke clearly, but not unkindly. "You will get off the ship in single file. Follow the marked path to the processing area. You will not be harmed." A translator, a Japanese-American woman in U.S. uniform, repeated his words in Japanese. Her accent was strange, a mix of American and Japanese that marked her as someone who had grown up between two worlds. The women walked down slowly, one by one. Kiko's legs trembled, though whether from fear or the weeks at sea, she couldn't tell. As her feet touched American soil for the first time, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She was the enemy now, a prisoner in the land she had been taught to hate. But as she walked past the American soldiers, something unexpected happened. One of them, young with sandy blonde hair, gave her a brief nod. Not threatening, not mocking, just acknowledging her existence as a human being. It was the smallest gesture, but it shook her more than any cruelty could have. The women were loaded onto military buses. Their windows offered glimpses of San Francisco as they drove inland. The city was alive with movement, cars everywhere, gleaming in the sunlight. Buildings tall and intact, windows reflecting the sky. People walked the sidewalks in clean clothes, carrying shopping bags, laughing. Kiko pressed her face to the window, unable to look away. Tokyo had been a sea of ash when she left. Entire neighborhoods reduced to blackened wood and twisted metal, children picking through rubble, old women pulling carts of salvaged nails and scraps. This city looked like it belonged to a different planet. "Is this real?" Yuki whispered beside her. No one answered. The bus eventually stopped at a military facility outside the city. The sign read Camp Stoneman in bold letters. Guard towers stood at intervals, but they seemed almost decorative, as if no one really expected trouble. The women were led into a large building where the processing began. First came the paperwork. American clerks, both men and women, sat at desks with typewriters, asking questions through translators. Name, age, hometown, unit assignment. The questions were routine, boring. There was no questioning, no threats, just forms being filled out in triplicate. Then came the medical examination. The women were led to a separate wing where female American nurses waited. Kiko's heart pounded as she entered the examination room. She had heard stories of what happened to captured women, stories that made her stomach turn and her hands shake. But the nurse who approached her was middle-aged with kind eyes. She wore a clean white uniform and held a clipboard. "Good afternoon," she said through the translator. "I'm going to check your general health. Have you been sick recently?" Kiko shook her head, unable to speak. The nurse took her temperature, checked her pulse, looked in her ears and throat. She frowned when she examined Kiko's hands, which were rough and scarred from years of field nursing. "You've worked hard," the nurse said gently. Kiko blinked, surprised by the observation. The nurse put ointment on a cut on Kiko's palm that wouldn't heal properly. The cream was cool and soothing. "This should help," the nurse said. She handed Kiko a small tube. "Put it on twice a day." Kiko stared at the tube in her hand. Medicine given freely to the enemy. After the medical checks, the women were directed to a large communal shower room. They walked slowly, bunched together for safety, their eyes darting nervously. Shower rooms could mean many things. The war had taught them that. But when they entered, they found only white tile, shower heads along the walls, and stacks of towels on wooden benches. A female American sergeant stood by the door. "You will shower and change into clean uniforms," the translator announced. "Your personal belongings will be returned to you after they are checked. Take your time. Take your time." The words were so strange that some women looked at each other, confused. Where was the urgency, the shouting, the humiliation? Kiko undressed slowly, folding her salt-stained uniform carefully beside her. Other women did the same, their movements cautious. When she turned the shower handle, hot water poured out immediately. Not lukewarm, not cold, hot. For the first time in over a year, Kiko felt truly hot water on her skin. It ran through her hair, washing away salt and sweat and the grime of captivity. Soap was provided in bars, real soap that lathered and smelled faintly of lavender. She scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, feeling layers of dirt and despair wash away down the drain. Around her, women were crying, soft, quiet sobs that mixed with the sound of running water. They had prepared themselves for humiliation. Instead, they had been given dignity. Yuki stood under the shower next to her, her small frame shaking. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are they doing this?" Kiko had no answer. When they came out clean and wrapped in towels, they found fresh uniforms waiting for them. Not prison rags, but simple, practical work clothes in gray and blue. There were even undergarments, clean and new. As Kiko dressed, she caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall. She looked human again. The mess hall was enormous, bigger than any dining place Kiko had ever seen. Long tables stretched from one end to the other, and the ceiling was high with exposed beams. But it was the smell that stopped the women in their tracks. Food. Real food cooking. To a large building where the processing began. The line moved slowly as women received trays. American cooks, large men in white aprons, spooned portions onto each plate with practiced efficiency. Mashed potatoes, green beans, sliced turkey with gravy, a bread roll, and in a small bowl, fruit cocktail with cherries. Kiko stared at her tray as if it might vanish. In the final months before capture, her meals had been rice mixed with barley, sometimes with a few vegetables or a small piece of fish if they were lucky. Toward the end, just rice, sometimes not even that. This tray held more food than she had seen in weeks. She sat at one of the long tables, the tray before her. Around her, women sat frozen, unsure what to do. One girl, no more than 19, touched the bread roll with one finger, as if testing whether it was real. "We should eat," Kiko said quietly. They went through the trouble of preparing it. She picked up her fork and cut into the turkey. The meat was tender, falling apart easily. She placed a small piece in her mouth and nearly gasped. It was seasoned with herbs, cooked perfectly, and it tasted like something from a dream. Her eyes watered, but she forced herself to chew slowly, to keep her dignity. Around her, other women began to eat, some quickly, as if afraid the food would be taken away, others slowly, savoring each bite. At the end of the table, a woman named Micho was crying openly, tears streaming down her face as she ate her mashed potatoes. An American soldier, young with dark hair, noticed. He walked over with concern on his face. "Is she okay?" he asked the translator. The translator spoke to Micho, who nodded and wiped her eyes. She spoke rapidly in Japanese. "She says the food is very good," the translator reported. "She hasn't eaten like this in a very long time." The soldier's expression softened. He nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. That night, in the barracks where they were housed, the women lay in actual beds with mattresses and blankets. The room was heated, not luxuriously, but enough to keep out the September chill. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the American military base, trucks moving, men talking, distant laughter. Yuki leaned over from the next bed. "Kiko," she whispered. "What happens to us now?" Kiko stared at the ceiling. "I don't know. Do you think they'll send us home eventually?" Kiko paused. "Maybe, but Japan is destroyed. What will we go home to?" The question hung in the darkness, unanswered. Across the room, another whisper rose in the night. "Did you see how tall they were? The soldiers, like giants, and so clean. Their uniforms were perfect. They really do look like movie stars." The whispers multiplied. Women finally daring to speak the thoughts they had been holding since the dock. In the darkness, where no one could see their faces, they confessed what they had observed. The Americans were not what they had been told. Not crude, not brutish, not without honor. They were something else entirely, and that realization was more terrifying than any cruelty could have been. The days at Camp Stoneman fell into a rhythm that felt surreal in its normality. A bell rang at 6 a.m., not harsh but clear, waking the women gently. Breakfast was served at 6:30. Eggs, toast, sometimes bacon or sausage. Coffee with real cream and sugar. The first time Kiko tasted coffee with sugar, she had to sit down, overwhelmed by sweetness she hadn't experienced in years. After breakfast, work assignments began. Most of the women were assigned to laundry, kitchen duty, or office tasks. Kiko, with her nursing background, was sent to help in the base hospital. She worked alongside American nurses, changing bedding, organizing supplies, and sometimes helping with minor procedures. The hospital was clean and well-stocked, with medicine that actually worked, bandages that were white and sterile, and equipment that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The American nurses treated her with professional courtesy. They showed her where things were, corrected her gently when she made mistakes, and sometimes asked about her nursing training in Japan. At first, Kiko answered with short, careful responses. But as days passed, she found herself talking more, explaining techniques she had learned, discussing differences in medical philosophy. One nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, was particularly kind. She was in her 30s with auburn hair and a quick smile. One afternoon, while they were restocking bandages, Sarah asked casually, "Where did you train?" "Tokyo," Kiko answered. "At the Army Nursing Academy." "How long?" "3 years. Then 2 years in field hospitals." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That's solid training. You're good at this." The compliment caught Kiko off guard. "Thank you," she managed. "I mean it. You have steady hands. That matters." Sarah paused, then added, "This war was terrible for everyone." Kiko looked up sharply, but Sarah's expression was sincere, not mocking. It was an acknowledgement of shared experience, of shared humanity. It left Kiko speechless. Work in the camp was light, almost absurdly so compared to what they had endured during the war. Shifts lasted 6 hours with breaks. There was time in the afternoons to rest, to walk the grounds within designated areas, to read from a small library of Japanese books that had been put together. On weekends, there was no work at all, and there was pay. Once a week, the women received small amounts of camp currency that could be spent at the commissary. The commissary was a small building stocked with items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, shampoo, magazines, even makeup. The first time Kiko entered, she stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the shelves. Behind the counter, an older American woman smiled at her encouragingly. "Go ahead, honey. Look around. I am a prisoner, but I do not feel like one. I am the enemy, but I am not treated like one." I was taught that Americans had no honor, no culture, no respect for human life. Yet every day I see evidence that this was a lie. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? And if everything was a lie, then what am I? She stopped writing, her hand trembling. The words on the page scared her. They sounded like the thoughts of a traitor. But she couldn't deny their truth. Across the room, she heard Yuki sigh in her sleep. Yuki was adapting faster than most. She had started wearing the lipstick she bought, had learned a few English phrases, and sometimes hummed American songs she heard on the base radio. Some of the older women disapproved, whispering that Yuki had forgotten herself, forgotten her people. But Kiko wondered if Yuki was simply being honest about what they all felt. The women's attitudes were splitting into different groups. Some, like Yuki, were adapting quickly, almost eagerly accepting their new reality. They learned English, smiled at the guards, and seemed to shed their identity as defeated enemies with surprising ease. Others held firm to their training and beliefs. Older women especially maintained strict Japanese customs, refused to learn English, and kept to themselves. They ate the American food because they had to survive. But they did so with visible reluctance, as if every bite was a betrayal. Kiko found herself somewhere in the middle, unable to fully embrace either position. One evening, a debate broke out in the barracks. It started when Hana mentioned that she had laughed at something Private Cooper said during his patrol. "You laughed," an older woman named Tomoko said sharply. "With the enemy?" "He was just being friendly," Hana said defensively. "He showed me a picture of his dog back home. It was funny looking. He is an American soldier. He is the enemy. Have you forgotten what they did to our country? Have you forgotten what our country did?" Yuki interjected suddenly. The barracks went silent. Yuki rarely spoke up in group discussions. We invaded other countries. We killed people. We started this war, and we lost. Maybe we're the ones who should feel ashamed. Tomoko's face went red. How dare you speak that way? Our soldiers died for the emperor. They died because old men sent them to die, Yuki said, her voice rising. And we nearly died too. But we didn't. Because the Americans didn't kill us. They fed us instead. They gave us medicine and beds and treated us like humans. Our own government left us to die on those islands. The Americans saved us. They are the enemy, Tomoko insisted. Then why aren't they acting like it? Yuki shot back. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Kiko sat on her bed, saying nothing, but her heart pounded. Yuki had spoken the unspeakable. She had voiced what many of them had been thinking, but were too afraid to say. Tomoko stood abruptly and walked to her bed, turning her back to the group. The conversation died, but the questions it raised did not. As November arrived and the weather cooled, the women were sometimes taken outside the camp for work details in the local community. Always under guard, always supervised, but still they left the wire and entered American civilian life. Kiko was part of a group sent to help at a local church that was organizing care packages for soldiers overseas. The church ladies were older women in floral dresses and pearls, their hair styled in elegant waves. They directed the Japanese women with polite firmness, showing them how to pack boxes with socks, candy, cigarettes, and letters of encouragement. One of the church ladies, Mrs. Henderson, was particularly chatty. She had white hair and kind blue eyes that crinkled when she smiled. "You girls are doing such a good job," she said through the translator. "Thank you for helping." Kiko was baffled by the gratitude. She was a prisoner being made to work. Why was this woman thanking her? During a break, Mrs. Henderson offered them tea and cookies, served on real china plates. The women sat awkwardly in the church fellowship hall, drinking tea and eating shortbread cookies while Mrs. Henderson talked about her son, who was stationed in Germany. "I'm so glad the war is over," she said. "I'm so glad everyone can go home now. You girls must miss your families terribly." The translator conveyed this, and Kiko felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. She did miss her family desperately, and this American woman, whose country had fought hers, could recognize that, could feel sympathy for her enemy's grief. On the drive back to camp, Kiko stared out the window at American houses with their neat lawns and intact roofs. Children rode bicycles. Men washed cars. Women hung laundry. Life continued, untouched by war. "They don't understand," Micho said quietly beside her. "They don't understand what war really is. Their homes were never bombed. They never starved." "No," Kiko agreed. "But is that a weakness or a strength?" Micho looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Maybe the fact that they don't understand war is why they can be kind," Kiko said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke. "Maybe because they never had to become monsters to survive, they can afford to be human, even to us." It was a profound realization, and it shook her. Japan had been at war for so long that brutality had become normal. Kindness had become weakness. But America, untouched on its own soil, still had the luxury of mercy. And that mercy, Kiko realized, was the most devastating weapon of all. You could fight against cruelty. You could harden yourself against brutality. But how did you fight against kindness? How did you maintain hatred for an enemy who fed you, clothed you, and treated you with dignity? You couldn't. In mid-November, the camp organized a movie night. A screen was set up in the recreation hall, and the women were invited to attend. The film was a Hollywood musical, something light and cheerful with singing and dancing. Most of the women had never seen an American film before, or if they had, it had been years ago before they were banned. Kiko sat in the darkened hall, surrounded by other prisoners, watching American actors sing and dance in glorious technicolor. The men were handsome in tuxedos, the women beautiful in flowing gowns. The sets were elaborate, the music sweeping. It was pure fantasy, pure entertainment. But it was also a display of wealth and confidence that took her breath away. Even their entertainment was abundant. Even their fantasies were luxurious. During one scene, the leading man appeared in a military uniform, tall and confident and impossibly handsome. In the darkness, Kiko heard Yuki whisper, "Just like the soldiers here." She was right. The Americans they saw every day, with their height and clean uniforms and confident bearing, looked like they had stepped out of this film. They were the movie stars her people had whispered about. They were the idealized version of manhood that Hollywood sold to the world, and Japan had tried to fight this. The realization was crushing. How could they have ever thought they could win? They had been fighting not just a military force, but an entire culture of abundance, confidence, and strength. A culture that was so secure it could afford to make movies while fighting a war. A culture that could afford to treat prisoners well. When the lights came up, Kiko saw that many women were crying. Not from sadness, but from understanding. They had seen behind the curtain, and they finally understood the vast gulf that separated their broken nation from this untouched one. That night, back in the barracks, the whispers were different. We never had a chance, did we? How did our leaders not see this? They lied to us about everything. Kiko lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. The Japan she had believed in, the noble empire fighting for honor and glory, had never existed. It had been propaganda, fantasy, lies built on lies. The reality was simpler and more painful. They had been poor, desperate, and doomed from the start, and the Americans had known it. That's why they could afford to be kind. The turning point came in early December, on a cold morning when frost covered the ground like white dust. Kiko was working in the hospital when an American soldier was brought in. Injured during a training exercise, Lieutenant Morrison asked Kiko to help with cleaning and dressing a deep gash on his arm. The soldier was young, maybe 22, with sandy hair and frightened eyes. As Kiko prepared the bandages, her hands steady despite her nervousness, the young soldier looked at her. "Thank you," he said in English. Kiko glanced at Lieutenant Morrison, who nodded encouragingly. "He's thanking you," she said. Kiko met the soldier's eyes. He was scared and in pain, but he was thanking her. A Japanese woman, an enemy, a prisoner. Without thinking, Kiko replied in careful English. "You are welcome." The soldier's expression softened, and he gave her a small, grateful smile. It was such a simple moment, but in that instant, Kiko understood something profound. He didn't see her as a monster. He saw her as a person who was helping him. The war, the propaganda, the hatred, none of it mattered in this room. There was just an injured human and another human helping him. When she finished bandaging his arm, the soldier thanked her again. Lieutenant Morrison walked Kiko to the supply room afterward. "You did good work," she said. "He was scared, but you kept him calm. That's the mark of a good nurse." Kiko felt tears threatening to fall. "In my country," she said slowly in English, "we were told Americans. No honor, no kindness." Lieutenant Morrison's expression grew sad. "I know. We were told terrible things about your people, too. But you know what? Most of it was lies, on both sides." Kiko nodded, unable to speak because it was true. All of it had been lies. That evening, she wrote in her notebook again, her hand steady now, her thoughts clear. "I am no longer who I was when I arrived." That woman believed in an empire, in honor through death, in an enemy without humanity. But I have seen the truth. The enemy is human, more human, perhaps, than we allowed ourselves to be. They won not because they were more brutal, but because they could afford to be less brutal. And now I must carry this truth back to Japan, to my family, to whoever will listen. The war was built on lies, and those lies killed millions. I will not lie anymore, not to others, and not to myself. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of transformation. She had been remade in captivity, not through cruelty, but through its absence. As winter deepened and 1945 turned to 1946, rumors of repatriation grew more concrete. The women would be sent home in the spring. The announcement should have brought joy, but instead it brought anxiety that kept many awake at night. Kiko lay in her bed listening to Yuki crying softly in the next bunk. She reached over and touched her friend's arm. "What's wrong?" Kiko whispered. "I don't want to go back," Yuki admitted. "Is that terrible? Am I a terrible person?" "No," Kiko said firmly. "I understand. How can I go back to hunger after this? How can I live in rubble when I've seen their houses? How can I—" She trailed off, but Kiko understood. How could they return to less when they had seen more? But it wasn't just the physical comfort they would miss. It was the way they had been treated, with rules, with order, with basic respect. Would they find that in destroyed Japan? Or would they find only chaos and desperation? In April 1946, the women boarded ships in San Francisco Bay. As the transport pulled away from the dock, many of them wept. Some waved at the American soldiers, seeing them off. Private Cooper was there, his hand raised in farewell. The journey across the Pacific was somber. The women talked quietly about what awaited them. They shared the letters they had received, preparing each other for the devastation they would find. When the ship finally approached Japan, Kiko stood on deck with the others, staring at the coastline. Even from a distance, she could see the damage. Cities that should have shown lights and buildings showed only low, dark spaces. The destruction was total. They landed in Yokohama and were processed by Japanese authorities who looked thin and exhausted. The officials stared at the women, healthy and well-fed, with expressions Kiko couldn't quite read. Resentment, confusion, envy. Kiko made her way to Tokyo, walking through streets she barely recognized. Her neighborhood was gone, replaced by a makeshift city of shacks and shelters. She found her family's location based on her sister's letters. When she saw Aiko, she almost didn't recognize her. Her sister had been plump and cheerful before the war. Now she was thin, her face gaunt, her clothes hanging on her frame. But when Aiko saw Kiko, she cried out and rushed to embrace her. "You're alive! You're home!" Their mother emerged from a shelter made of corrugated metal and scraps of wood. She looked older, fragile, but her eyes filled with tears when she saw Kiko. The reunion was bittersweet. They held each other and cried, grateful to be together, but devastated by what had been lost. Their father had died the previous winter, too weak from hunger to survive pneumonia. Their home, their neighborhood, their whole world was gone. That night, huddled in the cold shelter, eating watery rice, Kiko pulled out her notebook. By candlelight, she wrote down everything she had experienced, everything she had learned. She wrote about the soap, the food, the kindness. She wrote about Private Cooper's friendliness and Lieutenant Morrison's respect. She wrote about the movie that showed her the vast gulf between nations. Years later, Kiko became a teacher. She married a man who had survived the war and had 3 children. Japan rebuilt itself slowly and painfully, but it rebuilt. And as it did, it changed. Kiko never forgot her time in America. When her children asked about the war, she told them the truth. She told them about the propaganda and the lies. She told them about expecting monsters and finding humans. She told them about the soap and the chocolate and the soldiers who looked like movie stars. But the most important thing, she told her eldest daughter, was not how they looked. It was how they acted. They won the war, but they didn't have to treat us well. They chose to. And that choice showed me that strength doesn't come from brutality. Real strength comes from being able to show mercy even to your enemies. Her daughter listened carefully. Did it make you less Japanese? she asked. Kiko thought about this. No, it made me more human. And maybe that's the same thing. And so the image of those American soldiers on the dock, tall and confident in their perfect uniforms, became more than just a memory of physical appearance. It became a symbol of everything those Japanese women had to learn the hard way. That propaganda lies, that enemies can be human, that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence, but simple dignity. For Kiko and the 46 other women who returned from American captivity, the transformation was permanent. They had left Japan as believers in the empire. They returned as witnesses to a different truth. And while that truth was painful, it was also liberating. It freed them from the lies that had cost their nation everything. The soap, the chocolate, the hot showers, the soldiers who looked like movie stars. These were not just comforts. They were proof that another way of living was possible, a way based not on suffering and sacrifice, but on abundance and respect for human dignity. As one survivor wrote decades later, "We expected demons and found men. We expected cruelty and found kindness. It was harder to accept than any brutality because it forced us to question everything. But in the end, it saved us from becoming prisoners of our own hatred." That is a lesson worth remembering. If this story moved you or taught you something new about World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold histories. These stories matter. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there is still room for dignity, mercy, and hope.